In this particular case, it does require a certain amount of clarity because virtually everything that's being said about the current round of Israel's massacre in Gaza, virtually everything that's being said is simply not true. Saying it's not true is just the euphemism for saying it's a lie. And I think it is important to have some clarity on what actually is happening, what triggered it, what's happening now on the ground, and where things are headed. So let me begin with the beginning, namely the context of what's happening. And it's important to get the point of departure right, because we have to know what was the cause and what was the effect. We're told that the cause was the kidnapping and then killing of the 3 Israeli teenagers, and the effect was Israel's harsh reaction in the West Bank. That's the sequence. Virtually every account begins by saying it all started with Israel's, with the abduction and then killing of the 3 Israeli teenagers. But that's flat out false. The only proper context for understanding what happened is it began in April 2014 when Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, or Fatah, they formed a unity government. Well, after they formed the unity government, Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, he demanded that the United States and the EU break off relations with this new government because Hamas was a terrorist organization. Surprisingly, the United States and the EU said they would proceed to negotiate to work with the new government and then would decide on a step-by-step basis whether or not to persist in this relationship. At this point, Netanyahu was enraged. He was being consistently ignored, first on the question of Iran, when he claimed that Iran was on the verge of becoming a nuclear power and that Iran was threatening a second Holocaust against Israel. The United States and the EU persisted in its negotiations with Iran. And now on his home ground, on the question of Israel and Palestine, once again he was being ignored. He was saying Hamas is a terrorist organization. You have to break off relations with it. Both the EU and the US said no, we're going to continue in our relations. In fact, when the gift fell into Netanyahu's lap, the gift being the abduction and the killing of the 3 teenagers, but initially the abduction, even after that gift fell into Netanyahu's lap, the US continued to say, we are not going to break off relations with the new unity government. Well, now Netanyahu had a pretext. He knew full well from day one that, number 1, the kids were dead, and number 2, Hamas had nothing to do with it. But he saw an opportunity. The opportunity was to exploit the abduction and killing of the 3 Israeli teenagers to do what Israel always does. When Israel wants to break off what Israelis call a peace offensive, these nasty Palestinian peace offensives, because now Hamas had signed on into the unity government, and the unity government had said, we are accepting the EU-US terms for negotiations. The terms were renunciation of violence, recognition of all past agreements, and recognition of the State of Israel. Hamas had joined the new unity government, and then by inference, Hamas was accepting the terms of the EU and the US. So Netanyahu has a big problem on his hands. And as Israel always does, and it's not peculiar to Prime Minister Netanyahu, it's typical of the Israeli government, whenever you have to confront one of these peace offensives, the way you try to deflect the peace offensive is you start pounding and pounding and pounding the presenters of the peace offensive until they react violently. And so now Netanyahu had his pretext, the abduction and killing of the 3 kids. He then started going after Hamas in the West Bank, arrested about 700 Palestinians, I guess about the majority of them being Hamas, ransacking homes, demolishing 2 homes, and carrying on, as it always does at these moments, like a hooligan state, carrying on these rampages until Hamas finally reacts. And when it finally reacts, as it did, as anyone would under those circumstances, what does Netanyahu say? Look, you see, I told you, they're terrorists. You can't negotiate with them. In fact, this is a particularly odd situation because, in fact, it was not a Palestinian peace offensive. Ironically, this was a Palestinian surrender offensive. Prime Minister Abbas of the Palestinian Authority, he accepted all of Secretary of State's conditions for ending the conflict during the negotiations that were carried on what was called the Kerry Initiative, or the Kerry process. Abbas accepted that Israel could annex the major settlement blocks. Abbas accepted the nullification of the right of return. It's perfectly clear from the record, or what's been leaked from the record. He accepted everything. He accepted a defeat. But Prime Minister Netanyahu, because of coalition politics, he wouldn't even accept a surrender from the Palestinians. And so now he was determined to wreck the unity government so at some point in the future he wouldn't have to accept not a settlement based on international law, because at some point in the future he wouldn't have to accept a surrender from the Palestinians. Well, after the rampage in the West Bank, it gradually escalated, and at some point it turned into the ground invasion. I made many predictions along the way before the whole conflict started, the current round, about what would happen. And many people will no doubt recall that one of my predictions was, I thought it was impossible that Israel would be able to repeat what it did during Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9. That the international community had drawn a red line. The red line had a name. It was called the Goldstone Report. Even though the report of Richard Goldstone was eventually ignored, it set up a new standard. The standard was to Israel, no, you can't do that sort of stuff anymore. You went too far. And for a long time, my prediction held up. In November 2012, Israel launched Operation Pillar of Defense. We would call it a lesser massacre in Gaza. But that was a very different attack than 2008-9. For those of you who recall, during Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012, November 2012, they didn't target schools, they didn't target mosques, and the death toll was significantly different. It was about 170 people. Operation Cast Lead, it was 1,400. So up until that point, what I predicted turned out to be right. However, it's perfectly obvious now that I'm way off base in terms of the new massacre in Gaza. It's more or less on the same magnitude as 2008-9. I know people have said it's much worse. My guess is, I haven't yet seen, the dust hasn't settled, so I don't know what the final reckoning will be. But roughly speaking, it seems pretty much at this point, and we can make perfect comparisons because Operation Cast Lead lasted 22 days, and Operation Protective Edge now, I think it's the 22nd or 23rd day, if I'm correct. Is that right? I think it's 23rd. Yeah, that's what I thought. Operation Cast Lead, it was about 1,400 people killed, about 1,200 were civilians. Now it's probably around 1,200 killed, again about 80% civilians. It's roughly the same. The targeting, not only the targeting of hospitals, the targeting of the same hospitals, Al-Wafa, Al-Shifa, it's the same thing all over again. And now the question is, why was I so off base? And I'm not trying to defend myself, I'm trying to understand the situation, which is what we should try to do in order to enable us to accurately predict where things are heading. Politics can at best be, political analysis can at best be about trajectories, where things are generally headed. But politics itself is about taking advantage of opportunities, being skillful at exploiting the moment. And I mentioned gift number one that fell into Netanyahu's lap, the abduction and killing of the 3 teenagers, and then 2 new gifts fell into Netanyahu's lap. Gift number one was the vampire Tony Blair. Tony Blair, he's a clever politician and a vampire, and the two obviously aren't mutually exclusive. He's also a high-priced call girl, and those 3 are not mutually exclusive. Tony Blair, he dreamt up something clever. He said, let's come up with a ceasefire proposal which Hamas has to reject. And he comes up with this proposal. He hands it to that monstrosity, President Sisi. It's now called the Egyptian Initiative. And the initiative was quite clever. We're going to have a ceasefire, he said. And then he says, we'll lift the blockade. Well, that sounds reasonable. Ceasefire in exchange for lifting the blockade. That's what Hamas wants. But the language was very clever. We'll lift the blockade when the security situation stabilizes in Gaza. We'll lift the blockade when the security situation stabilizes in Gaza. Well, according to Israel, Hamas is a terrorist organization. So by definition, the security situation in Gaza can't stabilize until Hamas is disarmed. So in effect, Tony Blair's ceasefire was an ultimatum to Hamas. We'll lift the blockade if you disarm. If you don't disarm, then we're not lifting the blockade. Of course, Hamas had to reject those terms. That was gift number one. So now the whole world can be told that Prince of Peace, Prime Minister Netanyahu, he wanted a ceasefire. It was Hamas that said no. And then gift number two was the downing of the Malaysian airliner. When the Malaysian airliner was downed, Gaza immediately was replaced in the top headlines by what happened to the airliner. And as I said, Netanyahu, He's not genius, but he's obviously a competent politician. And it was perfectly obvious what was going to happen then. In 1989, there was the First Intifada. And during the First Intifada, which is giving Israel a very hard time, there was the Tiananmen massacre in China. Netanyahu gave a famous speech at Bar Ilan University, and he said Israel's big mistake was it didn't take advantage of the Tiananmen massacre to carry out a mass expulsion in the occupied Palestinian territories. So you know this guy knows how to connect unpredictable events with political initiative. That's politics. When the Malaysian airliner was downed, he saw the opportunity between the fake claim that Hamas had rejected a reasonable ceasefire. He now had the pretext to launch the ground invasion. Before I get to what happened after, I want to dispose of all of the nonsense that's been said about Hamas rockets, the miracle of Iron Dome, and now the tunnels that they have discovered in Gaza. Let's start with the first. Does Hamas have rockets? Now, when I conjure up in my mind a rocket, I conjure up something pretty tall, pretty impressive, and pretty destructive. That's a rocket in my mind. Maybe I have a quaint imagination, but that's what I see. So now let's use some simple common sense. Gaza has been under an airtight blockade for 7 years. Israel doesn't let anything into Gaza that can be remotely used for military purposes. What about those tunnels that Hamas has built or dug between Egypt and Gaza? Fair enough, it was a sophisticated tunnel economy, and probably military or militarily related material was smuggled in. I don't doubt that. I have no problem with that. But then, whatever they managed to smuggle in, they exhausted in November 2012 during Operation Pillar of Defense. Operation Pillar of Defense ends at the end of November. 7 months later is the coup in Egypt. The first thing Sisi did after the coup was blow up all the tunnels. He blew up the estimate about 95% of the tunnels. Nothing could get into Gaza. Nothing for the last year. So, where did these rockets come from? Where was the material to make them? As now is freely admitted, all of these rockets were homemade by Hamas with barely any materials. The reason these Hamas rockets have caused all of 3 Israeli casualties, civilian casualties, all of 3 Israeli civilian casualties, it's because they're not rockets. They're closer to firecrackers than rockets. Now, some of you may say, aha, Finkelstein is deceiving us again, because we all know that miracle of miracles, Iron Dome. What's the facts behind that? Number one, the top person in the world in this particular area of research is Theodore Postel at MIT. Postel was the first person to expose the nonsense about the Patriot anti-missile system during the 1991 so-called, the first Gulf War. At the time, they were saying the Patriot anti-missile system was 80%, 90% effective, for those of you who remember. What did it turn out? It turned out that maybe one Scud missile was deflected by the Patriot anti-missile defense system. And that was revealed about a year or two after the first Gulf War by Theodore Postal. Well, Postal was then asked recently, in the last month, it has to be the last 2 weeks, he was asked, well, what about Iron Dome? What is its efficiency? He put its efficiency, I'm quoting him, at 5%. 5%. It's not Iron Dome that's deflecting these humongous rockets. What's deflecting them is they're not rockets in the first place. Now, how do we know that? There's such a simple way to know that. If you use your brain for half a minute, just use your brain. Operation Cast Lead, 2008 to 9. It lasted 22 days. How many civilian casualties were there in Israel? Does anyone know? There were 3. Operation Protective Edge. It's lasted now 22 days. How many civilian casualties in Israel? 3. Operation Cast Lead, before Iron Dome. Operation Protective Edge, after the Iron Dome. What's the rational conclusion? Iron Dome did zilch. That's the rational conclusion. In fact, the rockets now being used by Hamas are much more primitive than the ones they used in 2008-9, because at that point they had managed to smuggle something in. Now it's nothing. Well, now Mr. Netanyahu has a problem. He boasted so much about the efficiency of Iron Dome, this miracle of miracles. If it's so efficient, then why are you killing all these Gazans? If it's so efficient, none of your civilians are being killed save 3, then why do you have to carry on like maniacs and lunatics in Gaza? So he has a problem. And he comes up with a new pretext. That's why the New York Times has people like Isabel Kirshner. She's there to just copy out anything that the Israeli consulate has. The reason we're attacking Gaza, because rockets, so to speak, don't fly anymore. The reason we're attacking Gaza is because of the tunnels. And day in and day out, they keep saying this whole operation is because of the tunnels. And that's supposed to explain to rational people why Israel is doing what it's doing. It's not the rockets anymore, it's the tunnels. So, when an Israeli naval vessel kills 4 kids on the beach playing soccer, it's because of the tunnels. And when Israel targets Al-Wafa Hospital, why? It's because of the tunnels. Even though nobody even claimed there were tunnels underneath the hospital. And when Israel targeted Al-Shifa Hospital and also targeted the playground nearby, well, it's obvious why they did that. It's the tunnels. And day in and day out, you keep hearing about the tunnels. as if the tunnels can in any way rationally explain why Israel's precision weapons are constantly killing kids and targeting manifestly civilian sites. Well, you could say Israel is doing it, since it's obviously not the tunnels. You could say Israel is doing it because it's a lunatic state. It's not a failed state, it's a crazy state. When Israel launched Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, the orders that were given to the Israeli combat forces, the orders were, blast everything in sight, because we don't want combatant casualties. Israel is in many ways a reverse of conventional societies. In most societies, they tolerate combatant casualties much more than they're willing to tolerate civilian casualties. Israel is a different kind of society. It's a kind of Spartan society in which military or combatant casualties are a source of much greater anguish and torment than civilian casualties. So the first rule is combatants aren't supposed to get killed. And so in Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, if you read the orders that were given, a lot of it was published, it was if you see a building in the distance, you don't ask any questions. You demolish everything in sight, so there will be nobody to even take a sniper shot at you. And that can explain some of what Israel has been doing now. So in Shujaya, the biggest massacre to date, in Shujaya, it was freely admitted. They said, we leveled the place because if we had to go in street by street fighting with the Hamas militants, we would have had to absorb a large number of combatant casualties, and so they wiped the whole place out. It wasn't only because of that. The other reason was the day before, 7 Israeli soldiers had been killed, and it became a kind of revenge operation that partly explained it. But that's not the larger part of the explanation, because contrary to what you might conceive, there hasn't been a ground invasion. It's not true. There has been an occupation a couple of miles into the border. There was and is a fear that if they were to conduct a real ground invasion deep into Gaza, they are, because they still might, but at this point, there's the fear that they will suffer some significant combat losses. And so they're holding back. They're still at the border. So, if they're still at the border, and it's not to protect combatants, why are they doing it? Why have they seemingly gone mad? And there the reason has been completely acknowledged by Israelis if you read it. Number one, it won't surprise anyone in this room, they're hoping that a terror bombing will bring Palestinian Gazans to their knees. They're hoping that you'll destroy everything in sight, there's a humanitarian ceasefire, the people come out, they see there is nothing, and then they say, then let's have a ceasefire and let's end it, because the devastation is so terrible. And the longer-term goal is, they hope that with all the death and destruction, people will eventually blame Hamas for what happened and will then seek to unseat Hamas. And in fact, that was the calculation during Operation Cast Lead as well. And there was some truth to it. The people of Gaza stood behind the resistance in 2008-9, but then a significant element of alienation entered when the people of Gaza asked themselves, for what? All of this death, Israel left behind 600,000 tons of rubble after Operation Cast Lead. All of the death, all of the destruction, the blockade was still there. So there was a feeling of Hamas got us into a mess. I don't think that's accurate, but that's what Israel's hoping will again happen this time. That's the purpose behind the terror bombing. And we should be clear about one point. There should be no doubt on one critical point. A couple of days ago, I got so I couldn't take it anymore. 20 days in front of the computer watching this thing unfold, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you begin to go mad. And my friend Sarah Roy, some of you may know her from Harvard, who lived in Gaza, knows the people and has a heart. She's a very decent human being. She sent an email to me, not to me personally, to people, describing the attack on the playground, another kid just blown to fragments. And Sarah's a very smart person, and she's an elegant person. She's a distinguished scholar, comes from a impressive family. Her mother was a survivor of Auschwitz. And then the last line in the email said, "I want to vomit. I want to vomit." And that just struck a chord with me. No fancy language, no rhetorical curlicues. I want to vomit. By the way, Israel's carrying on in Gaza. So I decided it was time to do something. I can't justify in my own mind just sitting in front of a computer. So I decided, okay, let's organize some sitting, get arrested. I don't know what it'll do, but I want to do something. And so I said, let's do it in front of the Israeli consulate, Israeli mission to the UN. And after I announced it, I went to bed, and I'm thinking in my bed, you know, Norm, you kind of made an error here. Why are you attacking the Israeli mission? Who was the enabler? Who allowed it to happen? Every day that pedantic, pontificating, insipid president, every day, no, it's a fact. Let's not kid ourselves. Every single day that man came out and said, Israel has the right to defend itself, each time he said it, he was giving Israel the green light to continue the massacre. That's a fact. Were it not for him, that could not have happened. And it's a very odd thing. There are people here, not many, but there are people here whose memories go back to 1982, the Israeli massacre in Lebanon then. How many people remember it? Raise your hand. Okay, some. It's a very strange thing, but facts are facts, and we have to acknowledge them. During the Israeli massacre in Lebanon in 1982, and that was quite a shindig, Israel killed between 15 and 20,000 Palestinian and Lebanese, overwhelmingly civilians, in those 3.5 months. But during the massacre, at one point, President Reagan, that brain-dead monster, President Reagan, at one point, he had this picture of a child. How many people remember? A child who was a victim of the Israeli attack in Lebanon. And he took the picture of the child who had been severely targeted, severely burnt, and put it on his desk. And then the Prime Minister at the time, Menachem Begin, he was going to prove that child was not targeted by Israel. And so a kind of little war of images, whatever you want to call it, in the stupid postmodern language, a war of narratives, whatever that means, went on between Prime Minister Begin and President Reagan. But the fact of the matter is, if we want to be truthful to ourselves, Ronald Reagan showed more heart than Barack Obama to what's happening in Gaza. Well, how is it going to end? There is an end game, and right now there are two contending parties. Hamas's position is clear. We want a ceasefire and the lifting of the blockade. The Israeli-American EU position is also clear. They want ceasefire, lifting the blockade, and disarming Hamas. And that's where we now stand. It's a kind of stalemate. And so, the most important thing at this point is to prepare for that kind of public battle. So let's ask the obvious questions. Number one, must Hamas be disarmed? So, Netanyahu shows the world, Hamas, terrorist organization, look what it did, look how horrible it is, and so everybody nods their head in agreement, of course. As one condition for ending the hostilities, Hamas has to be disarmed. But there's one problem with that narrative. I hate that word. As if there is a Nazi narrative of the Holocaust and a Jewish narrative. It's so stupid. Who started the hostilities? In 2008-9, in Operation Cast Lead, there was a ceasefire in June. If you look even at the Israeli Terrorism Center publications, I'm quoting it now, they said, quote, Hamas was careful to respect the ceasefire. How did the ceasefire end? Everybody knows on November 4th, Election Day in the United States, when attention was riveted to the US presidential election with Barack Obama, the Israelis, who, as I said, are very competent in taking advantage of gifts. On November 4th, 2008, Israel invaded Gaza, killed 6 Palestinian militants from Hamas, and that's when the whole thing started to fall apart. It was Israel that broke the ceasefire. That ceasefire agreement said in in June 2008, that ceasefire said the blockade was supposed to be lifted. Was it lifted? No, Israel tightened the blockade. So, in the first massacre, who initiated the conflict? Israel broke the ceasefire. Israel didn't abide by the conditions of the ceasefire. So, a rational person concludes it's Israel that should be disarmed. It broke the ceasefire. It violated the conditions of the ceasefire. 2012 November, it ends with a ceasefire agreement. Ceasefire agreement says the blockade of Gaza is supposed to be lifted. Was the blockade of Gaza lifted? No, in fact it was tightened, because beyond the blockade, then all the tunnels were blown up, and it was worse. In the last round, who broke the ceasefire? There was virtually no rocket attacks coming from Gaza after the 2012 ceasefire agreement. It all began to escalate when Netanyahu tried to provoke a Hamas reaction to break up the unity government. So, rationally speaking, if any side is supposed to disarm, it should be Israel that should be disarmed. What does international law say? The law is so clear. There have been enough textbooks written in international law on the topic to fill this room. The law is, under international law, a people struggling for self-determination has the right to use armed force to achieve its end. That's the law. Some people say the law is neutral. Okay, fair. You can make that argument. People like James Crawford at Oxford. Okay, fair enough. But nobody says, and I've read the whole literature on the topic, nobody says that a people struggling for self-determination do not have the right to use armed force to achieve their goals. Nobody says that's the law. On the other hand, international law is clear. It says a power that's trying to suppress a self-determination struggle, it doesn't have the right to use force. A self-determination struggle is the most basic right under international law. So again, on the basis of the law, if any side should be disarmed, it's Israel. It's not Hamas. That's the law. Israel says it's defending itself, has the right to defend itself. And that's true under international law. But the question is very simple. Is Israel defending itself? Is it trying to defend itself? Or is it trying to maintain the occupation? And those are two very different things. The most basic fact about an occupation under international law, the most basic fact about an occupation under international law, the most basic fact is occupations are supposed to end. It's 47 years since Israel occupied the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. One thing we can conclude with virtually scientific precision: Israel has no intention of ending the occupation. In fact, it is so determined not to end the occupation that it turned down a Palestinian surrender. Now, an occupation that goes on through eternity is not an occupation. That is an annexation. And annexations are illegal under international law. When Israel says it wants to defend itself and it demands of Hamas that it disarm, what Israel is really saying is it demands the right to maintain the occupation. That's what they're really asking. They want the right to maintain through eternity the occupation. And that's twice illegal under international law. It's illegal, number one, because occupations are supposed to end. Annexations are illegal. And it's illegal, number two, because Hamas has no obligation whatsoever under international law to disarm until Israel ends its occupation. As a practical matter, it's a very simple concept. Person A, let's call him, what's your name? Dan. Dan is throttling, what's your name? James. Dan is throttling James. James manages, in the course of being suffocated, he manages to scratch Dan a little. Dan is now enraged. He's furious at these scratches. And so beyond suffocating Dan, he starts to batter him, beat him, and beat him, and beat him, and beat him. And he says, it's my right of self-defense. He scratched me. It's my right of self-defense. Some people said, Dan has no choice. James is scratching him. Now, anyone with a jot of common sense and decency knows full well that Dan has a choice. If he doesn't want James to scratch him, all he has to do is to stop suffocating James. If Israel does not want to be the subject of occasional scratches, which is all that these rocket attacks come to, so-called rocket attacks, it has a very simple option. It could stop suffocating the Palestinians. It can pack up its bags, return to its state, its country, its borders under international law, and it can finally let the Palestinians live in peace. Thank you.